For generations, we've been taught that the foundations of mathematics, the breakthroughs in modern medicine, and even the calendar that governs our year all originated from a familiar set of civilizations. Those origin stories are repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and classrooms around the world. But what if I told you that many of them actually originated from Africans? Well, that's just the beginning. Today, we're uncovering the African achievements that were erased, reassigned, and rewritten, and why that distortion still shapes the world you live in. In the late 1800s, European archaeologists stood in front of the Great Zimbabwe ruins and refused to believe what they were seeing, not because the structures were poorly built, but because they were too magnificent to have been created by Africans. The stone walls rose 36 feet high without mortar, the engineering was flawless, and the city had once housed over 18,000 people at the height of a gold trading empire that stretched across the Indian Ocean. Instead of accepting the evidence in front of them, these Europeans invented elaborate theories attributing the ruins to Phoenicians, Arabs, Egyptians, even the Queen of Sheba, anyone except the Shona people who actually built them. And this pattern of denial and theft did not stop with architecture. Mathematics that you learned in high school came from Egypt over 3,500 years ago, when African mathematicians were calculating geometric formulas while Europeans were still figuring out basic agriculture. Medical procedures that save lives today, vaccinations, cesarean sections, brain surgery, were performed in ancient Africa centuries before Europe discovered antiseptic conditions. The astronomical calendar you use, the 365-day year, was developed by Egyptians who tracked the sun and moon with precision that modern scientists still marvel at. These are not theories or disputed claims. These are documented facts that were systematically erased, rewritten, or credited to Europeans who arrived thousands of years later and found knowledge they could not explain. But before we reveal how deep this theft actually goes, quick question. Are you learning something that challenges everything you were taught? If yes, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're exposing the history they don't want you to know. Great Zimbabwe was built between the 11th and 15th centuries by Bantu-speaking Shona ancestors, and the city became the capital of a vast trading network that connected Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and China. Archaeologists found Chinese porcelain, Persian glass, Indian beads, and Middle Eastern coins throughout the site, proving that this was not some isolated settlement, but a sophisticated commercial hub managed by African traders and merchants. The walls were constructed using a dry stone technique that required extraordinary engineering knowledge because each block had to fit perfectly without mortar. And the largest structure, the Great Enclosure, features walls that are 20 feet thick at the base and taper as they rise, a design that has stood for over 800 years. When Portuguese traders arrived in the late 1500s, they could not accept that Africans had built such structures, so they claimed it must be the biblical city of Ophir or the legendary capital of the Queen of Sheba. And here's where the pattern becomes undeniable. German archaeologist Leo Frobenius arrived in the early 1900s and found terracotta sculptures at Ife in Nigeria that were so artistically advanced he declared they must have been created by ancient Greeks who had established a colony in Africa. His theory was complete nonsense, but it was published widely and became accepted as fact for decades because the alternative, that Africans were master artists and engineers, contradicted the racial hierarchies that justified colonialism. The Ife heads, bronze, and terracotta sculptures created by the Yoruba people in the 10th and 11th centuries demonstrated a lost wax casting technique so advanced that European Renaissance artists had not achieved the same level of purity in their copper work. These sculptures were not crude or primitive. They were anatomically precise, artistically sophisticated, and technically superior to anything being produced in Europe at the time. Yet when they were discovered, European scholars insisted they must have been imported or created by non-Africans working in Africa. David Randall McIver conducted excavations at Great Zimbabwe between 1905 to 1906 and proved definitively that the Shona people built the structures, publishing his findings in academic journals that should have ended the debate. Gertrude Catton Thompson followed in 1929 with even more evidence, stating unequivocally that Great Zimbabwe was African in origin and built without foreign influence. Yet colonial governments in southern Rhodesia suppressed these findings for decades because acknowledging African achievement threatened the justification for white minority rule. Drop a comment right now. Did you know Europeans actively suppressed evidence of African achievement? What else do you think they're hiding from us? Because what comes next will show you that this wasn't just about buildings and art. Egyptian mathematics included division and multiplication of fractions, geometric formulas for calculating area and volume, and predictions of Nile flood levels based on astronomical observations. They divided the circle into 360 degrees and estimated pi at 3.16, which is remarkably close to the actual value, and they did this thousands of years before Greek mathematicians like Pythagoras and Euclid, who are credited in Western textbooks as the fathers of geometry. The Ashango bone, discovered in present-day Democratic Republic of Congo, shows mathematical calculations dating back 20,000 years, making it one of the oldest known mathematical tools in human history. Let that sink in. 20,000 years ago, Africans were doing complex mathematics. The Egyptians created a 365-day calendar by tracking solar and lunar cycles, developed water clocks and sundials to measure time, and their astronomical knowledge was so precise that modern scientists use Egyptian records to verify historical celestial events. Ancient African medicine included the use of salicylic acid for pain relief, which is the active ingredient in aspirin, kaolin for treating diarrhea, and plant extracts that kill bacteria long before Europeans discovered antibiotics in the 20th century. And this is something they definitely don't teach you in school. African doctors performed vaccinations by inoculating patients with mild forms of diseases, conducted autopsies to understand anatomy, set broken bones using traction, performed brain surgery, skin grafts, dental fillings, and cesarean sections under antiseptic conditions, while European doctors were still operating in filthy hospitals that killed more patients than they saved. In fact, the practice of smallpox inoculation that Europeans later claimed as their own was documented among enslaved Africans who had been inoculated in their home countries. European slave traders recognized the value of inoculated enslaved people and advertised them as such. Yet when it came time to credit the discovery, European doctors received the recognition for a technique they learned from Africans. But it wasn't just medicine and mathematics. African metallurgy was so advanced that it challenges everything you've been told about technological development. The Haya people of Tanzania were producing carbon steel in preheated furnaces that reached temperatures of 1,800 degrees Celsius, which is 200 to 400 degrees hotter than Roman furnaces, and they were doing this over 1,500 years ago. The iron produced by Congo smiths in Angola was so superior to European iron that when Portuguese colonizers tried to establish an iron foundry using European techniques in the 1750s, it failed completely because it could not compete with the quality of African iron. European iron of that period contained high amounts of sulfur and was considered rotten metal compared to the high carbon steel produced by African iron processes. The Africans had mastered preheating techniques, controlled carbon content, and produced steel that was more durable and of higher quality than anything Europeans could manufacture at the time. These weren't primitive people stumbling upon techniques by accident. These were sophisticated metallurgists who understood the science of their craft at levels that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. And then there's the question of iron's origins in Africa itself. For decades, European scholars insisted that Africans must have learned ironworking from Carthage, Meroe, or some other external source because the alternative, that Africans invented it independently, was too threatening to accept. But archaeological evidence from sites across West and Central Africa shows iron smelting dating back to 2000 BCE and earlier, predating many North African sites and suggesting independent development. Sites in Nigeria, Cameroon, Central African Republic, and other locations have yielded evidence of sophisticated iron production that developed without external influence. The bloomery processes used in Africa were more diverse and in many cases more advanced than those used anywhere else in the Old World. But this fact was buried under layers of colonial propaganda that insisted Africans were technologically backward. Tell us in the comments, does learning about African steel production that surpassed European techniques change the way you see history? What other inventions do you think were stolen? Because the story gets even more incredible. Ancient African furnaces weren't just producing iron, they were producing it at scales that rival industrial operations. At Great Zimbabwe in the 13th and 14th centuries, the substantial number of iron hoe blades found outside the great enclosure confirms that locally forged tools enabled agriculture on a scale to feed over 10,000 inhabitants. These blade forms were also used as currency, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of economics and trade. The absence of large slag mounds at the site suggests a tribute system where taxation of kona, small production sites throughout the region, met the demand for iron at Great Zimbabwe. This wasn't primitive barter, this was organized state-level production and distribution. African societies understood that iron was power. The production, control, and distribution of iron was pivotal in the rise and fall of African kingdoms and empires. The expansion of trade and cultural exchange, and the growth of military systems that ensured Africa's autonomy until the close of the 19th century. Iron tools revolutionized agriculture, allowing African societies to clear forests, cultivate new lands, and support larger populations. Iron weapons gave African armies military superiority, enabling the formation and maintenance of large, centralized states. And iron trade goods connected Africa to the broader world, with trans-Saharan trade routes linking West African iron to North Africa and the Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean networks connecting East African iron to markets across Asia. But perhaps nothing illustrates the systematic erasure of African achievement better than the way ritual and symbolism in African iron production was portrayed. Early European ethnographers, often missionaries and colonial administrators, focused obsessively on the role of magic and ritual in African ironworking. The tacit assumption was that African ironworking was held back by superstition, and this was presented as clear evidence of intellectual inferiority. What these Europeans failed to understand, or deliberately ignored, was that ritual in African metallurgy served the same function as apprenticeship systems and trade secrets in European guilds. It was a way of preserving technical knowledge, maintaining quality standards, and controlling access to valuable skills. The Dogon people of Mali have origin stories that describe how the Supreme Being's messenger, a Namo, stole fire from the heavens and brought it to earth along with the knowledge of ironworking. This isn't primitive superstition. It's a sophisticated way of encoding and transmitting technical knowledge across generations in an oral culture. Among the Luba people of Central Africa, anvils are both forging tools and royal regalia, and the cultural concept that equates kings with blacksmiths recognizes the transformative power of those who can turn raw ore into the tools and weapons that build civilizations. This wasn't ignorance. This was a different way of organizing and preserving knowledge, one that Europeans either couldn't understand or chose to misrepresent. And the misrepresentation extended to every corner of African achievement. These medical procedures were documented by travelers and later colonizers, yet the credit for discovering these techniques was given to European doctors who rediscovered them centuries later. This erasure was not accidental but systematic, because acknowledging African achievement would have undermined the entire colonial project that depended on convincing the world that Africans were inferior and needed European civilization. Every invention stolen, every structure misattributed, every achievement denied was part of a larger effort to justify slavery, colonization, and racial hierarchies that persist today in the way history is taught and whose contributions are remembered. When textbooks credit Pythagoras with geometry that Egyptians had mastered thousands of years earlier, when Edward Jenner is celebrated for vaccination techniques that Africans had been practicing for generations, when European metallurgists are praised for advances that African smiths had surpassed centuries before, it's not just historical error. It's deliberate falsification designed to maintain a narrative of European superiority and African inferiority. The question is not whether Africans achieved these things, because the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Archaeological sites, metallurgical analysis, historical documents, and the ruins themselves all confirm African genius. The question is, why this history continues to be suppressed, rewritten, or ignored when it challenges the narratives that generations have been taught to accept as truth. Why do museums in Europe still house 90% of Africa's cultural artifacts, often refusing to return them, even when their colonial theft is undeniable? Why do history textbooks still credit Europeans with inventions that Africans developed first? Why is the Pyramid of Giza treated as an anomaly rather than evidence of a broader pattern of African scientific and engineering excellence? The answer is uncomfortable but necessary, because acknowledging the full scope of African achievement would require fundamentally rewriting the story of human civilization, and those who benefit from the current narrative have no interest in doing so. Thanks for watching, and be sure to watch our other videos for more information on African and Black history.